The curtains in Amy Sllayton's little house in Dixon, Kentucky fluttered gently in the early morning breeze, pale sunlight slipping through the dusty threads like it was trying to sneak inside before anyone woke up. But the truth was, the house had been awake long before dawn. The walls had heard it. The floors had felt it. And Amy, poor, exhausted, barely standing Amy, had been living it. A chorus of cries, squeals, and tiny thumps rose from the living room like a storm building itself. The twins were awake. Again. Amy stood in the kitchen with her hair sticking out on one side, her pajama shirt stained with something that might have been last night's formula or yesterday morning's applesauce. She no longer had the energy to care. She wrapped both hands around a chipped mug of coffee, like it was the last anchor holding her to the earth. Behind her, another thump, followed by the sharp crash of plastic hitting drywall. Amy closed her eyes. Oh Lord, they're fighting again. And they were. Benny clutched his little green juice cup like he was guarding the crown jewels of England. Bobby, offended in a way only toddlers could be offended, shoved him hard enough to make him stumble back onto his diaper-padded bottom. Benny's face scrunched up like a crumpling balloon. Then the screams erupted. High, dramatic, full-body toddler despair. Another toy flew through the air like a little missile, bouncing off the wall with a bright crack. Amy dragged herself toward them like someone wading through wet cement. You two are worse than WWE wrestlers, she muttered as she reached the battlefield. Benny lifted his arms. Bobby grabbed her pajama pants. Both wanted to be held. Both wanted attention. Both wanted her and only her, because she was the one person who never left. But she was only one person. She let out a breath so long and so heavy it seemed to drain everything she had left. Where was Brian? Her brain repeated that question every morning now.
Where is
Brian? Her husband, Brian Levorn, was nowhere to be found again. He wasn't a bad man, not in the ways that counted. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't selfish on purpose. But he was a man who got lost in his work like other people got lost in movies. That mechanic shop was his safe place, his escape, his whole world. And Amy and the twins? They were often the background noise. Every time she called, the answer was the same. I'm busy at work, baby. I'll talk to you later. Always later. Later never helped her clean bottles. Later never changed diapers. Later never calmed two fighting toddlers. He loves them trucks more than he loves his own kids. Amy grumbled under her breath as she lifted Benny with one aching arm and steadied Bobby with the other. Her body was tired in ways that weren't physical. She needed help. She needed sleep. She needed a partner. But what she had instead was a life built on surviving one chaotic moment after another. And then, the front door opened without warning. The sound echoed through the house like a breath of fresh air, like the universe saying, here. One break. Just one. Rolling into the living room in her wheelchair was Tammy Sllayton, breathing heavy, smiling wide, and looking around as if she'd just walked into a circus instead of a home. What's wrong with you? Tammy hollered over the twin cries, her voice somehow louder than both kids put together. Amy threw her hands into the air dramatically. Since the crack of dawn, these children have been yelling. And Brian? Do you see him helping?
No.
Tammy, I'm gonna lose my mind. Tammy looked at the chaos. Two babies squabbling over a plush dinosaur, juice spilled on the carpet, toys scattered everywhere like someone detonated a toy bomb. And somehow, her expression softened. Just a bit. She rolled closer and held out her hand, wiggling her fingers. Hey, Benny Boo. Auntie's here. Benny, still crying, still outraged, paused. Then he blinked at Tammy, sniffled, and leaned toward her like she was a magnet pulling him in. The crying slowed. Then it stopped entirely. Tammy smirked. Well, look at that. I guess Annie's still got that magic touch. Amy threw herself onto the couch like someone collapsing after a marathon. Great. Use your magic, and watch them while I take a nap. Tammy laughed, but 2 hours later, she wasn't laughing anymore. Tammy spent those hours wiping snot, handing out toys, listening to toddler babbling, and preventing a total sibling war every 5 minutes. Her hair stuck to her forehead. She was sweating. Her arms were tired. She looked like she'd fought a dragon and barely lived to tell the tale. Then the door opened again. Brian finally walked in, his face tired and his work shirt streaked with oil. He scanned the room. The mess, the toys, the food mashed into the rug, the twins clinging onto Tammy, and something in him softened. For the first time in weeks, he saw it. He saw Amy's exhaustion. He saw the mess. He saw the workload he'd been ignoring. Amy stood with her hands on her hips, her whole body trembling with stress. "Brian, you need to help me more," she said, her voice cracking. "I cannot take care of twins by myself." Brian looked around the room again. And this time, he didn't argue. He didn't shrug. He didn't escape into excuses. "You're right, babe," he said quietly. "I'll make more time. They're my boys, too." Tammy wiped her forehead dramatically. "Well, praise the Lord. Look at that," she crowed. "He's finally learning how to be a daddy." The house that had felt tense and heavy just hours earlier suddenly felt different, warmer, softer, safer. And as Brian bathed the twins, read them bedtime stories, and helped clean up the chaos, Amy finally, sank onto the couch with the first real breath of relief she'd had in days. Maybe things weren't perfect. Maybe things were still messy. Maybe twins would always be a handful. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, they felt like a family. And in the Sllayton world, that was everything. The hallway outside the surgical wing felt colder than the rest of the hospital. Chris paced it like a man trying to outrun every memory that had ever haunted him, every moment when Tammy nearly slipped away, every night spent wondering if her next breath would be her last, every fight, every tear, every impossible promise they made to each other. He could still hear the muffled sounds of machines beeping from behind double doors, the quiet shuffle of nurses, the low buzz of fluorescent lights that never slept. And in that place, Chris felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel.
Fear.
Real fear, the kind that shakes a grown man to the bone. He leaned against the wall, taking a slow breath as he replayed the image of Tammy being wheeled back, pale, nervous, gripping his hand like she was holding on to the last solid thing in her life. He remembered the tremble in her voice when she whispered, "Chris, if something happens to me, just stay with me, till they take me back." And he had. He held her hand until the very last moment the nurses allowed him to. And even after she disappeared behind the sterile doors, he still felt the warmth of her palm lingering in his. He swallowed hard, rubbing the back of his neck. "Surgery's supposed to help," he muttered under his breath. "So, why does it feel like I'm handing my sister over to something that could take her from me?" He wasn't a man who broke down easily. But the truth was, Tammy's weight loss journey hadn't just been hers. It had been the entire family's. Every setback bruised them all. Every success gave them life. Every crisis reshaped their world. And now this skin removal surgery, this was the final step she had wanted for years. And yet, the most dangerous step she had ever taken. He sat down, elbows on his knees, his calloused hands clasped tight. Memories came rushing back. Memories he didn't ask for, but couldn't push away. He saw Tammy in her old bedroom years ago, barely able to move, surrounded by fast food wrappers and oxygen tubes. He saw her anger, her frustration, her hopelessness. He saw himself yelling, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. He saw their mother crying softly, afraid to say out loud what they all feared. If Tammy doesn't change, we're gonna lose her. And then he saw the opposite, the moments that held them together. Tammy laughing so hard, she couldn't breathe. Tammy fighting through rehab with fire in her eyes. Tammy standing on a scale and watching numbers drop lower than they had in decades. She had fought harder than anyone expected her to. But this surgery, this was the moment that tested not just her strength, but his ability to let go and trust the process. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Time didn't move normally in hospital hallways. Finally, a nurse walked out of the surgical wing. Chris stood instantly, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear anything around him. The nurse smiled softly, not big, not dramatic, just enough warmth to break the ice-cold fear gripping him. "She's still in recovery," she said. "But she's stable." Stable. Chris nearly collapsed with relief. Stable, stable, he repeated under his breath as if the word itself was a prayer. But then came the part that hit him hardest. The nurse added, "She's going to look rough at first. There's swelling, dried blood, bruising, all normal. When you see her, don't be alarmed." He nodded, remembering exactly what he would later tell the cameras. "At first look, it's kind of rough looking, 'cause you see the blood, dried blood, different things." Those weren't TV words. Those were the words of a brother preparing himself to see his sister in one of the most vulnerable moments of her life. He walked in slowly, every step weighed down by nerves and love and memories. There Tammy lay, tubes connected, dressings wrapped around fresh incisions, monitors blinking softly like tiny stars watching over her. She looked fragile in a way that broke him. But then something happened. Her eyelids fluttered. Her chest rose gently. She took a breath. A real breath. A steady breath. And that was all Chris needed. "The bee is alive," he blurted out with a burst of emotion he couldn't contain. He didn't care how he sounded. He didn't care who heard him. Relief flooded him so intensely that it cracked through the years of tough guy armor he always tried to keep on. She made it. She came through. His sister was alive. And in that moment, Chris felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Unfiltered, unshakable, overwhelming hope. He stepped closer, brushing a loose strand of hair from her forehead. "You did it, sis," he whispered. "You scared the hell out of me, but you did it." The cameras wouldn't show all of it. They might show a snippet, a tear, a short quote. But the truth, the deeper truth, was that Chris wasn't just reacting to the surgery. He was reacting to the years of carrying fear on his shoulders. He was reacting to the realization that his sister had survived something she once wasn't strong enough to even attempt. He was reacting to the fact that, for the first time in a long time, the future looked possible. And in that quiet recovery room, beneath the soft hum of machines, the complicated, messy, unforgettable bond between a brother and sister grew even stronger. Because she made it, and he was right there to see it. Recovery rooms have a strange sort of silence. Not empty, not peaceful, but heavy. A silence that holds its breath right along with the patient, waiting to see what happens next. And for Chris, standing beside Tammy's bed, that silence felt like the longest, deepest exhale of his life. He watched the machines more than he watched her. The rise and fall on the monitor, the numbers blinking in soft green, the pattern of her breathing. It wasn't that he didn't trust the doctors. It was that he had spent too many years waiting for phone calls that brought nothing but fear. Too many years holding the weight of every emergency, every setback, every near miss. So he stayed still, rooted to the floor like a man refusing to leave the most important post of his life. Tammy's fingers twitched slightly. Just a small movement, but to Chris it was everything. Memories flashed in his mind, uninvited but powerful. He remembered the nights he stayed up worrying when Tammy was at her heaviest, wondering if he'd wake up to news that her body had simply given out. He remembered arguments, big, explosive arguments, where he said things out of frustration and she said things out of pain, and both of them walked away hurting even more. He remembered the rehab center parking lot, the cold air, the moment he hugged her goodbye, not knowing if she'd make it, not knowing if she'd fight or just disappear into herself again. Yet here she was.
Alive.
Breathing. Recovering. He rubbed his hands together, pacing slowly at the foot of her bed. "Come on, Tam," he whispered. "Show me something. Wake up a little." A nurse entered quietly, checking monitors with practiced hands. "She's doing well," she told him. "Better than expected." He let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Better than expected, that's Tammy for you. Because for all her struggles, all her bad habits, all the times she pushed the world away, Tammy had a fighter in her, buried deep sometimes, but real. The nurse lifted a portion of the bandaging to check the stitching beneath. Chris caught a glimpse, the dried blood, the swelling, the angry redness of new incisions. It made his stomach tighten, but it also reminded him of something he later said on camera. "It's rough looking. You see the blood, dried blood, different things he hadn't exaggerated. And he wasn't scared of the sight. He was scared of the idea that one wrong turn, one complication, one infection could undo everything she had fought for. The doctor walked in, calm, confident, the kind of person who had seen 1,000 surgeries and still treated every patient like they mattered. He held Tammy's chart under one arm. "She's responding well," he said. "Vitals are strong. We'll monitor her closely over the next 24 hours. This was a major surgery, but she did better than anticipated." Better than anticipated. Those words rolled around in Chris's head like a blessing. He nodded, his throat tightening. "Thank you, document really." The doctor smiled. "She's lucky to have such supportive family." Chris didn't answer at first. He wasn't used to being praised, especially not for something that didn't feel like a choice. Supporting Tammy wasn't something he did for recognition. It was just what you do when someone you love is fighting for their life. He thought about how their relationship had swung like a pendulum over the years, from closeness to frustration to distance to fierce loyalty. They had yelled at each other, cursed each other out, and then pulled each other through the darkest moments of their lives. Siblings weren't perfect, but they were permanent. Chris leaned over and gently touched Tammy's hand again. Her skin felt cooler now, but her pulse beneath it was steady and real. "You scared me," he whispered, his voice cracking just a bit. "But I'm proud of you."
I hope you know that.
As if hearing him from somewhere deep inside her fog of anesthesia, Tammy shifted again, her breaths quickening for a moment before settling. It was small, barely noticeable to anyone else. But to Chris, it was like she was answering him. Another wave of relief washed over him. He thought about how far she'd come. From barely being able to stand, to walking with assistance, to breathing without a ventilator, to losing over 500 pounds. And now she had taken the step she once believed she'd never be strong enough for. He sat beside her, his voice steady, but filled with emotion.
You did it, sis.
"This ain't the end, it's the beginning. And I'm right here. I ain't going anywhere." He didn't have to perform for the cameras. This wasn't a TV moment. This was family.
Raw. Real.
Unfiltered. Outside the recovery room window, the sky began to darken, turning shades of deep violet and blue. Chris watched the sunset through the glass, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Cautious optimism. A belief that maybe, just maybe, things were finally turning. He turned back to Tammy, pale, exhausted, wounded, but alive, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future where she could live freely, where she could move without pain, where she could laugh without gasping for breath, where she could simply exist without fear of her own body. And as the hospital lights flickered on above them, he whispered again, "You made it through, Tam. You're still here." The journey wasn't over. The healing had only begun. But part 3 closed with one truth. Chris wasn't afraid anymore, because Tammy had survived the part he feared the most. Night fell over the hospital like a slow, heavy curtain. The bright hum of the day shifted into something quieter, something more intimate, the kind of stillness where every sound becomes sharper, every thought becomes louder, every emotion sits closer to the surface. Chris stayed in Tammy's room long after visiting hours closed. Nobody made him leave, maybe because the nurses understood, or maybe because they could see the way he watched her, like a man afraid that if he blinked too long, she might disappear. He sat in the stiff hospital chair, elbows on his knees, hands clasped like he was praying even though he'd never call it that. The faint beeping of Tammy's monitors echoed through the room, steady and rhythmic, the closest thing to comfort he could find. Every so often he stood up and paced, not because he had somewhere to go, but because stillness made his anxiety worse. He stopped at her bedside again, studying the way the surgical dressings rose and fell with each breath. It hit him all over again. She made it. She actually made it. But survival was only the first step. This next part, the recovery, would test her in ways the surgery never could. He remembered when he first saw her in rehab after she'd lost the first major chunk of weight. She had looked smaller, yes, but also worn down, like her body was adjusting to a new version of itself. Back then, The extra skin hung loosely from her arms and stomach, a constant reminder of the life she'd lived trapped for so long. And now that skin was gone. The removal left scars, long, red, angry lines that carved across her body like reminders of everything she had survived. The doctor had shown Chris the medical diagrams ahead of time, preparing him, but nothing could have prepared him for seeing his sister so vulnerable.
He swallowed hard.
Tammy shifted again, her brows tightening as the pain medication began to fade. A soft groan escaped her lips, small, weak, but unmistakably hers. Chris moved closer.
Tom.
You awake? Her eyelids fluttered, heavy like they weighed 100 pounds each. Then, faintly, her eyes opened. Barely. Just a sliver. But enough. Chris felt something inside him break, not in a painful way, but in a way that made every muscle in his body loosen at once. There you are, he whispered.
Cease.
Tammy didn't speak. She wasn't ready, but she saw him, and that was enough. Her gaze drifted around the room, slow and foggy, trying to piece together where she was. Chris gently placed a hand on hers, grounding her. You're okay. Surgery's done. You made it through. A single tear slipped from the corner of her eye. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just a quiet, exhausted tear from someone who'd fought harder than anyone ever gave her credit for.
He squeezed her hand softly.
I know it hurts, but you're safe. Tammy blinked, the movement sluggish. Her eyes drifted toward the window, where the faint glow of streetlights washed through the blinds. You scared me, Chris said, laughing weakly under his breath. But I'm real proud of you, Tam. You did what you had to do. For a moment, he remembered the version of Tammy from years past, the one who refused to walk more than a few steps, the one who lashed out whenever someone tried to help, the one who hid her pain behind sharp words and defensive walls. That Tammy felt far away now. This Tammy, the one lying in the hospital bed, stitched up, pale, fragile, she was still fierce, still stubborn, but she was alive.
And she had chosen to fight this time.
Chris stayed by her side, watching her drift back into sleep, her chest rising and falling with a little more strength. He leaned back in the chair, rubbing his face with tired hands. This wasn't the end of their journey. Not even close. There would be complications. There would be pain. There would be moments she wanted to quit. But tonight was a victory. Not the kind that made headlines. Not the kind fans saw on TV. Not the kind that ended with applause. This was the quiet kind, the kind shared only between siblings who had walked through hell together. The kind that came from knowing she was still here. Hours passed. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, replacing 4 bags, adjusting medications. Chris barely noticed. His focus never left Tammy. At around 3 a.m., he finally allowed himself to sit back, stretching his stiff legs. He exhaled, a long, heavy breath that carried days of worry away with it. A soft memory surfaced in his mind. He remembered Tammy as a little girl, running around the backyard, her laughter echoing through the summer heat. Before the wait, before the struggles, before the heartbreak. He remembered chasing her with a garden hose, spraying her until she screamed and ran, her hair plastered to her face, her giggles contagious. She was still that girl, somewhere deep inside. And tonight he felt like he'd gotten a glimpse of her again. He stood up, stretching his back, and whispered, "You're strong, sis, stronger than you know." And with that, Part 4 settled into a quiet, emotional close. Night held the hospital in a soft stillness, but inside Tammy's room, hope had finally begun to breathe again. Morning didn't arrive gently. It burst into Tammy's hospital room like a flood of white light, sliding across the floor, creeping up the walls, and spilling over the bed where she lay sleeping beneath crisp sheets. The machines beside her hummed in slow, peaceful rhythm, a quiet symphony of healing. Chris had drifted off in the chair sometime before dawn, his arms folded across his chest, his head tilted forward in an uncomfortable angle. He looked like a man who'd fought a war in his sleep. Heavy breaths, furrowed brow, twitching fingers. But the moment he heard Tammy's breathing change, he snapped awake. Her eyes fluttered again, this time with a little more awareness, a little more strength. Pain was there too, etched across her expression, but she was present now, more than last night. Chris sat forward. "Hey, morning, sunshine." Tammy rolled her eyes weakly. Even half-conscious and stitched together, she still had her attitude. Her lips moved, her voice hoarse and fragile. "Hurts." "I know," Chris murmured, leaning closer. "You just got a whole new body, sis. It's supposed to hurt." She attempted a small nod, but even that sent a ripple of discomfort through her. She sucked in a shallow breath, gripping the blanket with trembling fingers. "Water," she whispered. Chris reached for the small cup the nurse had left earlier. He held the straw carefully to her lips. Tammy took 2 tiny sips, slow, cautious, like her body had forgotten how to drink. But after the second sip, she closed her eyes and let the cool water settle inside her. Small victories. That's what recovery was made of. Chris watched her, feeling something warm expand in his chest. Relief. Gratitude. Maybe even pride. "You scared us all," he said softly. "Me, Amy, everyone. But look at you. You're a fighter." Tammy exhaled, a shaky, painful sound, but there was awareness behind it. Her eyes opened again. She stared at Chris for a long moment, her expression softening in a way he rarely saw, raw, vulnerable, stripped down to something honest. "You stayed?" she asked. "Of course I stayed," Chris replied immediately. "You think I'm leaving you after everything?" Her eyes glistened. Not dramatic tears, just the beginning of them, shining like little beads of truth. Chris leaned back in the chair, rubbing the sleep from his face. "Besides," he added with a grin, "I need to be here to make sure you don't start bossing these nurses around. I know how you get." Tammy tried to laugh, but the moment she did, she winced and clutched her side. Chris froze. "You okay? You good?" Tammy nodded quickly, breathing through it, eyes squeezed shut. "Still hurts," she whispered. "I know. Don't try to be funny yet. Save that for later." A nurse walked in just as Tammy settled back into the pillow. She wore pink scrubs and a soft smile, moving with the kind of gentle confidence that made patients trust her instantly. "Well," the nurse said, approaching the bed, "look who's awake again." Tammy's eyes drifted toward her, tired but alert. "How's the pain?" the nurse asked. Tammy gave a small shrug, the most she could manage. "Like I got hit by a truck." Chris snorted. "You look like it too." Tammy shot him a half-lidded glare. The nurse chuckled softly. "That's normal. You went through a major procedure. We'll get you more medication, and later we'll check your incision to make sure everything's healing right." Tammy swallowed, her throat dry. A flicker of fear passed across her face, quick but unmistakable. The idea of seeing the incision, seeing the new version of her body, it scared her. Not because she didn't want the change, but because she didn't know what she'd look like now.
Who she'd be now.
Chris noticed, of course. He always noticed. "Hey," he said gently, "I know it's scary, but you did this for a reason. For your health. For your future. And whatever's under those bandages, it's proof of how far you've come." The nurse nodded.
He's right.
"You're healing. You're doing everything exactly right." Tammy's gaze dropped to her stomach, the area beneath the blankets where the most skin had been removed, the place where the heaviest burden had lived for decades. Her voice cracked when she spoke. "I just don't want to look messed up." Chris leaned forward, his tone firm but loving. "Tammy, you were never messed up. You were hurt. You struggled. But you made it through things most people wouldn't survive." His voice lowered, more emotional than he intended. "You're stronger than skin. Stronger than scars." She blinked, letting his words sink into her. The nurse adjusted Tammy's fore and gave her shoulder a soft pat. "You're going to do great today. One step at a time." When she left, the room settled into a calm quiet again. Tammy's breath slowed, her eyelids growing heavy as the medication began to kick in. Chris watched her drift back into sleep, deeper this time, more peaceful. And as he sat there, he realized something. This wasn't just Tammy's recovery. It was his too. Amy's. The whole family's. Every step forward she took, every pound lost, every scar earned, every breath fought for, changed the trajectory of all their lives. For the first time in years, Chris allowed himself to imagine a future where all of them felt lighter. Not just in weight, but in spirit. He sighed softly and leaned back in the chair. "We got you, Tam," he whispered. "All the way." And part 5 came to a quiet, hopeful close, the storm calming, the healing beginning, the family bond tightening in the stillness of a brand new morning. The days leading up to Amy's breaking point felt like a slow-moving storm, not loud enough to scare her away, but heavy enough to wear her down piece by piece. She had been juggling everything at once, stretching herself thin between motherhood, filming, family responsibilities, and the emotional weight she rarely admitted out loud. People saw the smiles on TV. People saw the jokes, the sass, the funny one-liners. But they didn't see the nights she sat alone in the dark living room, staring at a blank wall while the kids slept, wondering how much more she could carry before something inside her snapped. And then it happened. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't the kind of moment you see in movies where someone throws a chair or screams at the sky. It was quieter, the kind of breaking that feels like a soft crack inside the soul. Amy woke up one morning, looked at her reflection in the mirror, and didn't recognize the person staring back. Her hair was messy, her eyes were tired, her cheeks were pale from stress. She looked like someone who had been surviving, not living. Someone who had forgotten what it felt like to choose herself. And that terrified her. Because for years, she had been fighting the world. Her weight, her critics, the cameras, the expectations. But suddenly, she realized she had begun fighting herself. She whispered into the mirror, "I can't keep living like this." Those 6 words were the beginning of everything that came next. She thought about the promises she made to herself after the divorce. The promise to live freely, to love without fear, to take care of her heart. Somewhere along the way, she had slipped back into old habits, hiding her pain, distracting herself with chaos, laughing through exhaustion. But this time, the weight wasn't physical. It was emotional, and it was crushing her. That morning, she sat on the bathroom floor, knees pulled to her chest, and let years of exhaustion pour out of her in silent tears.
No cameras.
No audience. No jokes to soften the blow. Just Amy finally feeling the truth she had been avoiding. And then, as if the universe chose that exact moment, her phone buzzed. A message from the one person whose voice felt like a warm place in winter. Brian. A simple text, "Good morning, beautiful. I hope today feels lighter." She stared at the message for a long time. Not because of the words, but because he saw her. Really saw her. Even in moments when she felt invisible. That single message was the spark. The spark that pushed her to stand up. The spark that reminded her she wasn't alone. The spark that whispered, "You deserve better days." She splashed water on her face, took a deep breath, and made a silent vow, not to anyone else, but to herself. "I'm rebuilding me, even if I have to do it one tiny piece at a time." This decision, subtle, quiet, deeply personal, would change the course of her life in the weeks to come. It would set the stage for the announcement, the transformation, the moment the world would soon witness with shock. But for now, it was just Amy standing in her bathroom, choosing herself for the first time in a long time. And sometimes, that's where the most powerful stories begin. The shift in Amy wasn't loud or obvious at first. It didn't show up in grand gestures or dramatic scenes. It showed up in the small, almost invisible choices she began making every single day. She woke up earlier, not because she had to, but because she wanted to watch the sunrise through her kitchen window. That soft orange light felt like hope, like a reminder that her life wasn't stuck. It was just waiting on her to move again. She started saying simple words she had never been good at saying before. "No, not today. I need a break. I need help." Those words were tiny acts of rebellion against the version of herself that once felt obligated to carry everyone else's world on her back. Now, she was learning to carry her own gently. She spent more time with the boys, not rushed time, not multitasking time, but real, present, grounded time. She listened to their giggles, watched them run around the living room, let their innocence remind her of something she had forgotten. Joy is still allowed here. And Brian noticed. He noticed the glow returning to her cheeks. He noticed the way her laughter became less forced and more real. He noticed the way she looked at life like someone who had finally opened a window after years of stale air. One evening, he surprised her with something simple but meaningful, a slow walk through the local park after the kids had fallen asleep at her sister's house. The night was cool, the moon bright, and the world quiet enough for her to hear her own heartbeat. They walked side by side without saying much. She didn't need to explain her pain. He didn't need to fix anything. He just stayed beside her, present, steady, patient. And at one point, she stopped walking, looked up at the sky, and whispered, "I'm trying." Her voice trembled, not out of weakness, but out of release. The kind of trembling that comes when someone stops pretending they're fine. Brian placed his hand gently over hers and said, "You don't have to go through anything alone anymore." Those words hit her deeper than he knew.